That's terrific. Okay, one for Dan. A really interesting question. So, you've talked a little bit about how the Gulf is responding to this, but could you unpack a little bit how the Gulf is thinking about Israel in light of this war? In what ways has it changed Gulf perceptions of Israel? This is obviously a very big deal, and my own sense is that the Gulf response is somewhat mixed. So take us through what you're hearing, Dan, from the Gulf states in terms of, and your own, if you're not hearing anything, or if they're keeping it quiet themselves, how you expect they will respond to Israel after this, how it may change Israeli relations with the Gulf.
No, it's a great question, and I think it probably happens in different phases at different times. Right now, we're in a window of really acute risk, uh, where the risk that this splashes across the water onto them is meaningful. I think they're somewhat more confident than they were in the past that they've taken steps to prevent that, but it's real. It wasn't long ago that the phrase "Little Sparta" was used by a former CENTCOM commander to refer to the UAE. I think the Gulf states are out of the Sparta business, and the undisputed Sparta of the Middle East these days is Israel, backed by the United States. And that kind of military dominance and I would say a willingness to use military force to change the equation on the ground is quite potent. It isn't what they chose. It wasn't the course of action that they were looking for at this moment when they were focused on economic modernization and détente with Iran. Um, I think that for different Gulf states will have different reactions. And by and large, efforts to weaken Iran, I would say, ultimately are favored by the Gulf states, although although I would say that they have to deal with what's left. And it's striking that the Iranian capabilities and threats and proxies that are the least diminished by the last 20 months are those that are the closest to the Gulf, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and short-range missiles as well. So they're still under a lot of threat. I think when it comes to Israel, the countries that have built relations with Israel probably take some comfort in the fact that they have a strong horse on their side. I think the countries that have staked more on de-escalation and diplomacy, like Oman and Kuwait, are probably, and less on relations with Israel, are more apprehensive about a region where Israel takes more strategic initiative and calls more of the shots. Um, but I think just about everywhere there's a real mix. I don't think anyone likes the kind of imperialism and aggression and bullying that Gulf states have been subjected to over the last several decades by Iran. And there is some satisfaction in that. But I think beneath that, there's a deep unease because they were pursuing a different strategy that I think had paid some dividends for the states involved. And I think that strategy may run aground on some of the contradictions of this moment when it comes to the approaches that other states are pursuing vis-a-vis Iran.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, one for Colby. Um, Colby, obviously, everyone is focused now on the Strait and the potential for disruptions there, right? That is obvious. But there have also been some changes, disruptions, if you want to put it that way, with regard to hydrocarbons in the Eastern Med, right? So on the other side of the Middle East, Israel shutting much of its gas production, halting gas exports to Egypt. Should the stuff that's going on in the Eastern Med on the western side of the Middle East, is that something that we should be thinking more about? Is that meaningful in from your perspective? You're muted, Colby.
Sorry, you'd think after all these years, unmuting myself on Zoom would be a little easier, but sorry about that. Anyway, yes, there are certainly risks to the East Med with this situation. I think the Strait is and what goes on in the Gulf beyond the Strait is a lot more consequential to the global economy writ large than what takes place in the East Med. And I think the attention that each region gets is to some extent commensurate with that. Egypt does have some of the more immediate consequences for LNG markets. Egypt has really been in an energy crisis for the last couple of years now, due to the fact that it took this very heavy supply side approach to trying to meet its domestic gas demand, and that's what makes it so reliant on pipeline imports from Israel. So the need to turn to LNG exports for Egypt is something that certainly increases their import costs. takes LNG away from the wider market and has an effect on prices as a result there. But it is more of a regional impact than it would be to have some sort of severe disruption in the strait. But I think it's an important question, and it's not something that should totally slip off the radar. Especially, if you have some sort of resulting situation where Egypt returns to mass blackouts again at a time of regional volatility. Their ability to procure LNG cargoes has been pretty strong, so it doesn't seem like we're headed in that direction. But I think it does underscore a lot of the risks of things taking place in the periphery. I mean, for instance, if there were some impact to Iran's ability to export gas to neighboring countries, Iraq would feel that effect very severely. These things kind of slip off the radar when they don't have the same macroeconomic effect as a lot of the major oil supply disruptions or LNG disruptions. But they are still present, and they are often felt much sooner. So, that's an area that I've been keeping track of closely, and definitely still should be on everyone's radar as this goes on.
That's great, Colby. Thank you. All right. We've got a whole bunch of questions that I want to pose to each of you in your areas of expertise. As all of you know, I am always very focused on the long term, and this is why I'm at Middle East Institute and no longer in the U.S. government. I kept trying to get the U.S. government to think long term, and of course, politicians in a democracy tend to like to think short term. But we've got a whole bunch of questions I think are really important for us to be considering at this moment in time about the long term in the Middle East and the impact of this war. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to pose to each of you in turn different aspects of these questions that were being asked. So General, what's going on now, all kinds of new stuff, drone warfare, targeted killings, the acceptability seemingly of preventive war, even though it's being couched as preemptive, it seems to be much more preventive war. On the other hand, at the end of this, it seems like Iran is going to be even weaker than it was. And so a major destabilizing force in the region should have less ability to destabilize the region. How do you think about the region in terms of its long-term military strategic stability? Do you think that this war is more likely to make the region more stable, safer? Are we going to be able to finally pivot to Asia? Or do you see this as just ushering in yet another period of renewed instability as the region seeks to kind of cope with whatever the fallout from these operations are?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. It's kind of what I was alluding to in my last point that I mentioned in my opening comments here is about kind of what happens with the region in terms of this. From a U.S. standpoint, I'll just start with a U.S. standpoint here. I do think we should have the military capacity to do more than one thing at a time. I do regret what's happened over a long period of time with our spending, with the lack of reliability and of congressional funding that comes to the department, so we can make the investments that we need to. I think that's hurt us in the long term, and I think we need to address that so that there is some stability in the amount of money that comes to the Department of Defense, so we can make investments in the Pacific, but at the same time look at where we have other interests like the Middle East. We have to get to a point here where we can have a sustainable presence in the Middle East. So we don't have to keep whipsawing every time something happens here. I think this is really, really bad for the department. I think it's really bad for the force. I think the United States Navy is really feeling the effects of this right now. So we've got to address that aspect of it from a U.S. standpoint for how we're going to protect our interests globally. And in the Middle East, and I said this as a CENTCOM commander, I recognize the prominence of the challenge that we have out in the Indo-Pacific. There's no doubt about that is existential to us, and we have to pay attention to it. But at the same time, we also have to make sure that we that we are looking after our own resources and our own interests in the region, and that we have a sustainable level of presence there that can actually look after that. That builds confidence in our partners and allows us to react to the very dynamic situation there. With regards to the region itself, I do think I kind of like the way that Dan highlighted that the new little Sparta here. I think that's actually pretty accurate, frankly, and I think that that is going to give a little bit of a rise to other countries in the nation in the region trying to up their own capabilities and look at their own self-defense. So I think we have to pay attention to that. I do think, presuming we can get to some kind of an end state here where Iran can perhaps kind of come back into the region, I do think a security cooperation focus that is focused on helping the countries of the region build their own capabilities, both especially in the maritime domain here, to look after their own responsibilities. I think is an important aspect of it. I also think this will hopefully give some impetus to making some inroads in what has been really, I think, a long-term problem in the Middle East, and that is integration of capabilities between the partners. In general, it is kind of a one-to-one relationship. There's not a lot of trust between countries, even on the Gulf Arab side of the Arabian Gulf there. They don't. There's trust issues there. I think we have to look at addressing those things. I guess my point is I think we need to focus on a strategy and a policy that is really about building resilience and capability in our partners to look after their own affairs and to provide for their own security, so that with a small but sustainable presence of U.S. Forces in the region, we can keep things in check. I think that's what I'm kind of thinking about long term here, Ken.
That's great, John. Okay, Dan, I want to come to you. So the questions also ask a lot about the kind of long-term diplomatic and political nature of the Middle East and how that might be changed. How do you see and I sort of asked you this already in terms of the Gulf states' perceptions of Israel, but there are also question marks about, how the Gulf states and how all the states of the region may relate to Iran, may relate to us or to China, right? How do you see the diplomacy and the politics of the region being changed as a result of this conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so hard to know because it's kind of like we're right in the middle of the unraveling, and we don't really know what the resolution of this is going to be. Is Iran left as a kind of weakened but lashing out regional state that menaces and threatens its neighbors? Is there some kind of diplomacy to address Iran's nuclear program and get back to some path of de-escalation? Do we have a breakout and another war, which I think is really possible given the way that we've kind of created the decision tree, let's say, from here, that Iran makes a series of decisions that lead to more U.S. military intervention. So we're really in the middle of it, and it's hard to totally look past it. That said, I suspect that the threat perception from Iran will remain an important factor in shaping the region, but I think there might be more space for less of a binary polarization and more other actors, whether it's Turkey and the Levant or some of the Gulf players. You might have a little bit more multipolarity. If you were to actually deal with the Iran threat, I think you might have sort of greater centrifugal forces that actually, instead of bringing people closer together, have the paradoxical effect of creating more independent agendas. But my guess is that the Iranian threat is going to remain. One thing that I should say when it comes to regional integration and the prospects for the region is a giant hole that I really should have mentioned earlier in talking about perceptions of Israel, which is Gaza. It's just a major unresolved issue. It's a major unresolved issue for the Gulf. It's on the phones and of every member of the public in every country in a way that it's not in the United States. And that continues and creates political constraints for Gulf leaders who have seen over time that despite their drawing power when it comes to Israel and the allure when it comes to Israel, that ultimately they haven't really been able to meaningfully shape the Gaza conflict or bring it to a close in the way that they want. So I think that things like Saudi normalization, maybe this removes some of the brakes on the way, but it doesn't remove the one that the Saudis have most publicly articulated, which is something on the Palestinian issue. So that, particularly the resolution on the ground in Gaza, but then also the larger question, it's just so much a part of things that we can't ignore it in thinking about the future of the regional architecture. But I think that Iran will probably still be dangerous, barring regime change, let's say. But I think that if Iran is meaningfully weakened, you probably have more local initiative from more different places within the region.
Great stuff, Dan. Okay, Colby. Now here's the version that is directed to you, which is, do you see this conflict, yet another war in the Middle East? Do you see it as changing global energy markets? Could this be the final spur to, lead us to move away from hydrocarbons, or could it be the exact opposite, especially if oil is not really affected at all, which is a very reasonable outcome for reasons that you've suggested, I've suggested in other webinars, lots of other people have as well. Maybe we get through this without any attacks on oil. Does that simply kind of, routinize and, further dig us in around hydrocarbons as the future? How could this change the world's relationship to hydrocarbons?
Well, I think what it does in the long term is that it underscores that for as long as we live in a world where we're consuming 100+ million barrels of oil a day, the Gulf is going to remain a very important part of that. And that the risk of losing it is something that will have a strong macroeconomic impact whenever it emerges. As I've mentioned on a couple of previous sessions, the relatively more muted price reaction at this point is due to a couple of reasons. One is that there has been plenty of overreaction in the last couple of years to potential supply disruptions from the region, and so I think there's a little bit more caution in trying to anticipate that as being imminent this time around, because this is basically the world we've been living in since October 2023. But Gulf producers are really taking this kind of last man standing strategy in regard to the oil industry due to the fact that they have large reserves, low production costs, and high volumes of production. And while it doesn't come to the front of the agenda for many people right now, they also have a very low upstream carbon intensity, which means that the emissions associated with their production are lower than in many other regions. So even if we are getting to a point where, say, we're approaching peak oil demand by the end of the decade, any major risk to the stability of supply from the region is still going to be important even after there is a plateau. I commented on another session that although we don't necessarily live in the world of war plus Middle East equals high oil prices anymore, we could again. And a lot of what's made the difference there is the U.S. shale industry. Which is, for the most part still going strong. It may face a decline this year, but it does have a shorter life expectancy than the supply that comes out of the Gulf, and it needs higher costs to survive. That isn't going to change, and the idea that the U.S. is a major supplier now that mitigates the risks of supply loss from the Middle East is not something that's going to be able to remain a factor in perpetuity. So the security of supply from the region is going to remain important. But in regard to your other question about diversification away from oil and gas or from supplies from the region, that's something that's very possible as well. And something that my colleagues and I at Energy Intelligence are spending a lot of time focusing on is this energy in the age protectionism. And the idea that there's more of a push for energy sovereignty. So you may see some countries that have domestic oil and gas resources put more energy into trying to develop them, or potentially develop alternate sources that lower the potential for a risk of a disruption to imports. The longer this goes on, the more that may accelerate that type of a change and put some put some more emphasis behind the need to diversify that type of supply. You've seen China do that with domestic production, and trying to promote electric vehicle proliferation. That's not because they care about the environment. It's because they want to move away from the amount of oil that they need to import. This may accelerate some of those trends in the longer term. But until we do see a massive decline in oil consumption in the world, and gas consumption, which is set to rise for much longer than oil consumption will, the region is going to play a large role. And this just this latest iteration of conflict in the region, I think, is just underscores that ultimately we're nowhere near close to a world where we can live without the energy that this region supplies.
Outstanding. All right. General, we got a whole bunch of questions here about regime change in Iran. And they're more or less along similar lines, but I'm going to put them to you in this way. The president has making lots of comments, seems to be kind of threatening that at some point he might order it if the Iranians don't do exactly what he'd like to do. If the NSC sat down and wanted to start thinking about, okay, how would we do a regime change in Iran? And let's recognize, the president's also said he doesn't want to put boots on the ground in the Middle East, certainly not in large numbers, right? So let's assume that an Iraq-style invasion of Iran is off the table, but nonetheless, there is a desire to either bring about regime change or simply threaten the Iranian regime by undertaking military operations that could result in regime change. Could you spin out for us a little bit what you might recommend, how you might try to structure American military operations to try to bring about regime change in Iran, assuming the president wanted to do so?
Yeah, sure. Great question. Thank you, Ken. So, I'll go back to my soft roots here. I really like the idea, if we're trying to do this, of trying to manipulate and put pressure on the levers of power for the current leadership, to make things difficult for the supreme leader, for the ruling elite around him, and really put the pressure on him. And I think one of the ways that can be done, and it can't be done quickly, that has to be done over time, and has to be done with a deliberate effort, is through kind of an irregular warfare campaign, where we do look and identify partners on the ground, with maybe not necessarily ourselves, but who can act on our behalf, and through a variety of actions, whether it's sabotage or whether it's just doing internal things to create problems for the ruling administration there, to really undermine their authority, undermine their control of the state. I think the supreme leader, I think the ruling elite really benefits by the fact that they control all of the levers in the country. And, I think this is why we have not necessarily seen a successful popular uprising against the supreme leader, even though there are probably millions of Iranians that would like to see him go away. They don't see it's worth it, because there is such a stranglehold on this kind of police state and on the people and their ability to rise up. So I think what has to happen is you have to pursue this in a more subtle manner over time. And you need to take kind of an irregular warfare approach to this, where we develop partners on the ground, we support them, we commit to it. It isn't just the military, it's intelligence community, it's our diplomats, it's the power of our information. Interesting, one of the things I read just in the last couple of days has been the power of instruments like the Voice of America, for example, in a country like Iran, and how people really pay attention to that kind of stuff. I know there's a lot of criticism of that, but those are the types of tools that we need to develop to really wage an effective irregular campaign. If we're going to look at undermining the regime. That's kind of my thought on this. There's certainly other ways to get after this that are much more direct. I think those come with a variety of of challenges, but the one thing I do kind of continue to come back to is this more regular approach to to undermining regimes.
Great. Okay, Dan, I've got three or four questions here around the same topic of negotiating with the Iranians going forward. What I'm going to do is I want to make a comment to you. It's how I perceive this. I want to see if you agree. If you agree, great. I'd love to have you unpack it a little bit, explain why, what that should look like. If you don't, I'm just as interested in that and explain why and how you do things. And my comment to you, and again, this is reflected in many of the comments, is that in some ways, what the U.S. has done is has made the circumstances a little bit harder for itself because ultimately the result of this campaign, now joint U.S.-Israeli campaign, is that we have to ensure that this Iranian regime never acquires nuclear weapons, right? And arguably the best way to do that is to have some kind of an agreement with the Iranian regime at the end of it that they will never do that, that there are going to be severe limits on enrichment, all other nuclear activities, that all of that is going to be heavily monitored by the IAEA, which is why you'd want to do this diplomatically, why you'd like to get a negotiated agreement, at least in my mind, so that you can get that level of monitoring there in perpetuity. But of course, by attacking Iran and by the US attacking Iran, we may have made it much harder to get the Iranians back to the table. They were at the table. They've now said to heck with that, which we may not like, but is certainly understandable on their part. Right? And we may have convinced many Iranians that the only answer to their strategic problems is to get a nuclear weapon. And so I see a real catch-22 here that is going to require some very, very deft and subtle diplomacy on the part of the Trump administration, employing a combination of, inducements and threats and blandishments and compromises that I think is going to be extremely important, but tough to do, especially given what we've done. So first, if you agree with that, unpack it a little bit. If you don't, tell me why you think that's wrong.
Ken, I really do agree with that. I think that the most reliable path here is diplomacy, but diplomacy always needed to be backed by the prospect of force. And now, whether we like it or not, it just is backed by the use of force by Israel and by the United States. Now, I think President Trump's feeling was that you can throw your adversary off balance, that you can kind of create the conditions on the ground that you want before you start the talk. But you're dealing with a rigid, ideological, gerontocratic, and hard to reach by cell phone group of people at the moment, which is going to make kind of fast food diplomacy really hard here. It's going to be really hard to say you have 21 days or else X and Y happens. I think it's time for us to find some way to get off the clock and then to own the clock when it comes to that diplomacy if we want it to have any chance of working. I think that that means working in phases. Phase one is probably de-escalation. You have a bunch of partners in the Gulf and Turkey, and probably even this would be a case where maybe the president's relationship with Russia could actually provide some benefit to the national interest of the United States if Russia privately tells Iran to look seriously at diplomacy. I think the next phase, you need to have some kind of a phased approach here. You're not going to get to absolute victory or unconditional surrender or something in any short window. You need some kind of a freeze where the Iranians either freeze what they're doing, and the U.S. has inducements they can offer, including Israeli strikes are still going on. Perhaps we can find some way to use the conclusion of that operation as a lever. America has lots of diplomatic levers here. We have inducements we can offer. Snapback is still on the table for the Europeans to put sanctions on Iran all the way through October. But I think we've gone through this experience of a series of nasty surprises for the Iranians, but which may have had a military benefit, but diplomatically make this next phase harder. And I think now it's time to find a way to take a breath, bring in a bunch of trusted partners, and see how we can consolidate the military benefits that we've gotten into something more lasting. And on that, I think if we can get Iran not to follow through on a threat to leave the NPT and to have some kind of inspection, that would create the kind of predictability that would make a whole lot of other steps a lot easier down this road. So I agree, Ken, harder, not impossible, and worth doing.
Excellent. All right. Well, we've still got about 20 questions out there. Apologies. We're not going to get to them today. And I will say that in some cases, I didn't feel like we had these were not the right questions for necessarily this group of people, but we're going to be doing additional virtual briefings during the week. And I promise I'll bring in other experts who will be better able to answer some of the questions that got posed today. Until then, General Votel, Dan, Colby, thank you all so much for joining us. I think that the light that you shed on this was incredibly important and useful, certainly for me, I think for our audience as well. Thank you all for taking the time. And we will be speaking to all of you again soon, I have no doubt. Thank you all.